Good day, everybody. Thank you for the introduction and welcome to the session today. As we've heard, my name is Brian Singer, as you've already been told. And what we have heard today so far, I've heard a lot of folks speaking about the rise in cybersecurity incidents against the OT environment. One of my main roles here at Accenture is I represent our OT capabilities within our global incident response practice. So we wanted to put a session together today to really focus on what does it mean to be proactive and reactive in your incident response planning and your incident response activities, and why we're such a need for preparing for when that worst day actually occurs, how you're going to respond to it, and how you're going to make it through. And having worked probably somewhere around 200 incident responses over the many years I've been involved in OT security, I can tell that we've definitely seen a really large difference in what it means if you have an organization that is very well prepared for that worst day versus ones that are purely reactive. So we're going to speak a little bit today about what it means to be prepared for incidents and ready for when that worst day happens. So one thing I've noticed in the last couple of years in particular, there's been a lot of myths that have really started to kind of pop up. And I'm hearing these over and over again. And one of the main ones I've been hearing quite a bit is we're overstating the threat actor capability. In other words, we've looked at the global attack scheme out there, and a lot of folks have said, hey, look, it's all very simplistic attack. Nobody really knows what they're doing when they're going after OT. And really, that really is having, again, responded to a lot of incident responses, that are having been involved in a lot of incident response over the years, that's really troubling to me, because what we're normally seeing a lot of times is that, yes, there are broad categories of automated attacks. There's a lot of using tools, a couple of tools like Shodan and other internet sources that are used to do and find broad classes of vulnerabilities, but then exploit them. But then, as we've even seen, even by the malware and the incidents that we're aware of, and like Norse Hydro was mentioned, we talked about Stuxnet, which I hate to be the first one to mention that today if that's the case, but Trisys malware and a number of others out there. And that even those cases and examples that we have show that when somebody really goes after an OT environment, it is anything but simple. And a lot of times, we have a really prevailing wisdom of the idea that we only look at what's going on the surface. So really, again, what we're really seeing is that there may be a lot of very easy attacks on the surface, but when we really peel the layers of the onion back in a lot of these incident response engagements, we find out that those attacks are anything but simple. Now, obviously, we kind of bring up the wastewater attack that happened in Florida recently. That is one example where, hey, look, that was in many ways a very simple attack, because a lot of that information was exposed right out there and available for the attackers to find. Now, again, I would really look at that incident and say, well, these are probably a lot of system administrators these days that are questioning some of their life choices. That, yes, we've had a lot of attacks against OT that are very simplistic, but even a lot of the examples that we use every day, we find out that they're anything but simple. Another big myth we've seen a lot is it's all just ransomware. And I will admit that a lot of the incidents that we've been responding to have been ransomware incidents. However, there's several categories and classifications of ransomware out there. And a lot of the IRs we worked, including a very large one last year, ransomware was basically adding insult to injury on the way out the door. It was burning the house down after they'd stolen everything, to use a couple of metaphors. And what I mean by that is the attackers had used, going back to myth number one, had used broad classes of searching for vulnerabilities. They found a number of places that were susceptible. They launched their attacks, gained the bastion host, but then the actual hands-on keys attackers took over from that point. And we have a number of cases where we've seen those attackers actually go into OT systems, pivoting in and researching and looking at engineering workstations and laboratory information management systems and HMIs, for example. Now, do we know that they targeted OT? In some cases, yes. In some cases, we think they were just lucky in doing research. But either way, it's not all just ransomware. And the first thing that we really need to do is resist the urge to chase a false flag and say somebody must have brought a USB drive in that poisoned the environment, and realize we do need to peel the layers of the onion back and understand what actually happened. How did they make it onto the system? Another one, again, just to kind of set the stage for today a bit, OT systems are obscure and not a real threat out to the environment. Well, I really hope that everybody, I've listened to the session so far today, and I think that hopefully this myth is being really well tackled, that people realize, no, OT systems are becoming increasingly prevalent again, and that we see in attacks. because attackers are starting to realize that when we see OT security incidents. I mean, these have pervasive market-based impacts. I mean, these can actually impact your organization. The minimum impacts we've often seen are anywhere between $20 and $40 million, and that's just getting started. Right? So really, we've been talking about cyber physical for years, and cyber physical has been mentioned even several times today. However, I've been in this field for a long time too. Do we really understand what cyber physical means? And what I mean by that is we give a lot of lip service to it, but what does that really mean? There's still a very heavy over-reliance, in my opinion, that we say it's cybersecurity, let's get the IT folks involved, let's put the burden of response on our IT folks, right? Well, the problem is, and I'll use this as a live example. A few years ago, I was working on a simulated red-blue type activity where there were teams that were positioned to do various things, and they were going to score points, and it was a live fire exercise. But one of the team I was on with a couple others was actually to find a way to initiate a partial stroke test on a valve, and there was an SIS and there was a basic process control system in there. But our objective was to find a way to crack the valve open, a very cyber physical attack using only network traffic to do so, right? So what we found is that we figured out really quickly how to send the correct instruction, how to use the right protocol, how to form the packet, how to send the instruction. We got all of that right very, very quickly. It was not hard to figure out. And we started sending that command over and over and over again, like any good pen tester would do, right? Send it hundreds of times and pray that one works, right? But we started executing that command over and over again, and it was detected by the IT SOC, by the network management system. It was detected by the tools. The tools did their job. They detected the attack. Somebody's trying to open a valve from an unauthorized location, right? However, when the IT folks started notifying about that attack, they were talking to engineers. The engineers looked at the notification, and then they looked at the valve. Valve hadn't moved. Nothing had changed. So very quickly, they dismissed this as a false flag in the system, as a false positive, and they actually ignored the attack. Well, that doesn't really stop folks like us. We're going to continue to work on this. And during the course of the day, we found out that we were actually not computing the checksums correctly in the packet. We didn't have the right structure and everything in there. But when we did figure that out and started issuing the commands correctly, and the valve started to open, guess what? IT SOC had dismissed as a false positive, engineers had dismissed as a false positive. So when the command was successful and the valve opened, nobody noticed it, failed to act, right? And this to me really highlights the difference between trying to monitor communications on a network and looking at that traffic and deriving from there that there's a cyber physical compromise. Okay. And it's this lack of communication. Darren really mentioned earlier from Norfolk Southern, it was really good. The concept of those relationships that we need to build. Those relationships are very important because this is how you're going to get folks speaking the same language. And I love the way he presented it. There's something weird going on. Can you help me explain that? And that's often the way most of these incident response engagements typically start, right? If something is odd in the system and we don't just dismiss it to a maintenance problem or a lubrication schedule problem or a condition monitoring system, we go in and we take the next level of inspection down. Because having been involved in industrial cybersecurity for a long time, again, I'm upwards of nearly 100% of finding issues on control networks every time we go and look. Now, does that mean that every one of those is the next Stuxnet or the next Trisus? No, it does not. It obviously doesn't mean that. However, we see a lot of things that can be rejected that aren't going to necessarily cause an impact to operations. However, it is very important to then connect the dots with the engineering organization to help them say, okay, here are the attack flows. Here are the attack paths that matter. Here are the indicators of compromise that matter to us so that you can align your program, that you now have a balance between your IT SOC operations and your OT SOC operations, and you're speaking the same language that when things start to occur, people are actually responding the way they should. Okay. So again, I'd like to just one thing a technique that I've been working with for a little while here is the concept of how do we really get into fundamentals of cyber physical. And it's the way I've been started to do this quite a bit is to evaluate likelihood in 3 times. Right. So the first thing is going to be on the left-hand side, in the left purple box there, are going to be your system inputs and ingress points. So I'm going to use a simple example for today. We're just going to say it's a web portal, right? We're going to use something very simple. So the first thing you want to look at is what what is the likelihood? What is the attractiveness of the target to the attackers? What's the attack surface look like? What is the likelihood they're going to find their way onto these entry points in the system? Okay, and those entry points, again, let's say it's if you find it sitting out there on Shodan and it's very easy to go and pick up, well, guess what? The likelihood of somebody finding that attack path is probably pretty high. But on the left-hand side, this is where all of that data that you have from your cyber vulnerability assessments, from your IT and your OT SOCs, from your SIEMs, from your MDR strategy, your managed security providers, attack flow analysis, threat intelligence, all the data that tells you about the attacker motivations. These are all things that feed that left-hand side that give you an idea of what that left-hand side input looks like. What is the likelihood, exploitability, attractiveness of the target, and the attack surface that says, there's a really good chance that an attacker is going to end up on this system. All right. Second to that is you have to look and say, what is the systems they're going to gain access to? Let's stick with a simple example still, and we're going to use an engineering workstation. So if they're able to use that input on the left and gain access to an engineering workstation, the likelihood of the successful compromise there is say, hey, well, now they have access to the controls inside of the environment, the control programs and things like that. Right? They have to, if the likelihood of that is high, we know that there's a good chance they're going to be able to do something more with it. Now, if you have just a internet joyrider that happens to find this system and ends up on an engineering workstation, chances they're going to know what to do with the ladder logic and the control in the engineering workstation, probably pretty low. Okay. So the third level of likelihood is what's the likelihood they're going to take that access and take that knowledge and convert that into cyber physical compromise in one way or another. So that is where we now start to look and say, okay, well, they got access to the engineering workstation. Do we have a safety instrumented system? If we have an SIS and it's not online with all the rest of the other systems, then the chance that they're going to cause a cyber physical compromise is probably fairly low still. They could cause other damage, but they're not going to cause the really bad failures. But now let's say in that middle box, we have an engineering workstation and the safety builder on the same machine. Suddenly, the attacker has the keys to the kingdom. They can rewrite the safety instrumented function. They can override the different set points and limits that are there. They can change things within the basic process control system, and they now have access to potentially cause a very catastrophic scenario on the further right side, turning it into cyber physical damage. So again, if we're looking at IT incident response, if we're looking at our OT incident response, these are the pieces of language that we need to start being able to speak, and that we need to get the engineers to the table to help us understand what attack flows, what are those systems out there of compromise that we need to protect, and what events in the IT SOC and from all the other tools that we have out there reporting events on the network, which of those events matter to us because of this attack flow. Okay? So going with the start, stop, and continue a little bit, I've turned this a little bit on its head to say, all right, what is the cost of inaction? What is the cost of doing nothing? And we're looking at it across people, process, and technology. I hear this a lot. We all hear this a lot. Can't happen to us, won't happen to us. Nobody would attack us. We're too busy, all those things. And time again, we've had cases of customers that have been hit out of the blue. They just didn't take the time. They never prepared. They never said, this is actually a viable threat to us. Well, hopefully everybody has started to listen to some of the examples of today. And I know that there's certainly a broad increase in awareness that OT systems are an increasing attack surface out there. We are seeing them occur more and more. Right. And when you have no action out there, especially on the people side in this apathy, a lot of times when we see things like the Target attack and Equifax and some of the others that have happened, the attackers have been out there for months to years before any damage was caused, right? And this is what happens when you have apathy around it, okay? Process, rather than having an IR plan or partners, depending on suppliers or vendors, I love the accountability versus responsibility. And I wrote a couple notes to myself in there that said, hey, look, we really do need to have a culture of accountability. You own and you execute your plan. And several of the incident response engagements I've worked on where somebody was just sitting around, well, our vendors will help us, right? Well, that's great. However, if you've got 5 different vendors, you're going to get 5 different answers. And vendors, again, are not necessarily aligned to provide the incident response services you need. And I've worked with a lot of these folks. They have a lot of really good folks out there. However, that's not necessarily the most optimum strategy, right? It doesn't mean that vendors aren't invited to the table. We'll get to that in a few moments. But one thing I really wanted to make sure I mentioned today as well is, from an incident response perspective, when you have an over-reliance upon, hey, we're not going to have a plan, we're not going to have anything ready to go, we're going to wait for our vendors to help us when that day happens. It's these days, a lot of the solutions that are evolving, top-tier type solutions, it's getting very difficult to choose a bad product these days. Now, there may be some that may be more fit for purpose, but it's getting very difficult to choose a bad product these days. However, it's still very, very easy to choose a bad implementation, right? And we've seen a lot of times where even the best laid products are not deployed according to, not deployed in a way that's actually aligned with the attack paths and the cyber physical knowledge of the system. And we're not collecting the right data. We're not reporting the right events. And I've had several IRs where we've had some of these best in class solutions that we're talking about that completely missed the attack because they weren't deployed in a way that was aligned with the attack path, right? Another thing is, again, just assuming that everything in the technology side, just because it's running, doesn't necessarily mean that it's all okay, right? Cost of taking the wrong action. What happened? What are the wrong actions out there? These are the things to stop doing. And again, remember, look at the example we used earlier, an over-reliance on IT to monitor and prioritize criticality of OT events, right? They're not the engineers. That doesn't mean we don't use them. You just need to learn how to start speaking the same language. But we still see an over-reliance upon, hey, IT, this is a cybersecurity problem. We need IT people at the table, right? You do need IT people at the table, but you also need the engineering and the OT folks over there to help bring context to what we're looking at, okay? On the process side, OTIR plans must include the physical recovery of assets. This is where your suppliers, your integrators, your EPCs, and your vendors need to come back to the table. They need to be there for this part because, again, we're talking about potentially, anywhere between hundreds and thousands of points that may need to be replaced during a cyber physical event, anything major that happens out there. And have you taken the time to write an incident response plan that includes how many spares you're going to have on hand, how you're going to get recovery of assets out there. And if you look at IR planning from an IT side, normally it's focused most heavily upon recovering data, recovering availability of the system, not so much about the physical aspects of the system. So in the wrong action side, we want to make sure that we definitely take time to figure out what we're going to do in the case of a cyber physical compromise. And have we aligned our recovery plans with our suppliers, vendors, and EPCs to make sure that they're there to aid us in that worst day, not necessarily work against us, right? Technology, placing and relying on sensors only at the IT-OT border. I've heard it mentioned a couple of times now. I believe it was from one of our talks during Jason Holcomb's talk, when they brought it and talked about, hey, that they're actually deploying sensors throughout, analyzing data where the events actually are going to occur. That is absolutely key. Getting sensor placement and log aggregation working correctly is absolutely key to being able to effectively monitor and respond to a cyber physical event. All right. All too often, we still see, and like I mentioned a moment ago, we've seen these tools that are deployed in the wrong location. They don't catch the actual event because there's an over-reliance on the IT. They put them only at the border. They don't necessarily monitor for what actually are the events that are going to occur, events that are going to impact them. So I said a lot of times we've seen OT personnel are not engaged to proof the system and know that things are safe. I mean, again, what we had in particular, one big IR case last year, the question that our team came in to answer is it safe for us to return to service? Because we knew the attackers had gotten onto engineering workstations and laboratory systems. And so we had to come up with a plan for how to help them recover their assets and do it safely to check whether or not somebody had compromised PLCs or other switches or done other things in the environment that could cause them to say, hey, there's a latent threat waiting for you that's been deployed during this attack. So again, a lot of times our OT incident response is getting involved to help with that safe return to service procedure. One thing we've certainly seen when there's an over-reliance on your IT department, when there's no real plan for the OT side, when we're waiting for our vendors, some of these shutdown windows that we've seen organizations go through have been weeks to months in several cases. In fact, I'm aware of one case where it was about a 9-month stoppage because of the cyber physical attack, and their customer would not take an order from them until they had shown that there had been absolute proof in the system that everything was back to normal. So, I don't know about most organizations out there. I love the rail examples earlier. I don't think we really have an option to say we're going to shut down all of rail and all of our transportation, all of our shipping for a period of weeks to months. We have to get things back up and moving. And the only way you're going to do that effectively is if you have worked all these plans out in the beginning. So what does the cost of action look like? What are the things that we need to do out there? What are the actions that we do need to take? All right. One thing, and I'm really glad that the point was made earlier, is building those relationships. IT and OT cross training, having people at the table to speak the right language, right? And going back to and I know using a single slide to represent a very complex subject is kind of like having a single meme in social media represent 150 years of the Tudor history in England or something. It's an oversimplification of a complex subject, and we definitely know that. However, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't take no action because it's hard. We take the action because it's hard, right? Doing that attack flow analysis, understanding what are the things you need to do in the system to keep it up and available, those are absolutely key, all right? Process, tabletops, adversary threat. On the proactive side, the organizations I've seen have the best day are the ones that do proactive threat hunts. They conduct their disaster recovery activities regularly. Vendors are an integral part of their response plans. Right? On the technology side, it's bringing in all the other tools that we've been using in IT for a while and putting them in the OT environment for endpoint data protection, host intrusion detection, sensor deployment, log aggregation, syslog, all getting that right, getting the meaningful contextual events up to pardon me, getting those meaningful contextual events up to the right location so that they can be detected and responded to in a timely fashion. So again, what are the impacts or really the benefits seen of the cost of taking the right action? Timely communications, timely response. I've watched several organizations that when they've gone through their first event, it hit 20, 30, 40 sites. The next time they went through it because they took the right action, it hit 2 or 3 sites before it was contained. We do see that these techniques are effective, and there's really no excuse to not take action anymore. Another big piece we see too is a lot of times we've had incidents, and after the incident, we've analyzed what was the efficacy of the MSSP, MDR services, other type of third-party services, and we have taken those lessons learned, fed them back into the procurement process to say, now we know a lot more about what we want from these organizations, what time they respond, what type of incident, right? So I wanted to leave everybody with something here today. This is kind of closing out a little bit. What are some of those key actions to take now? And I know it's really bad to kind of read the slide to everybody, and I'm not going to do that today. But this is a bit of a checklist that you can go through. And after this is over, and certainly welcome to contact myself or many others that can really help you figure out where do we sit with that? Where does our organization sit? But one of the most immediate things, and I love the 4-letter word asset inventory. Everybody talks about asset inventory. However, I'd like to evolve that concept a little bit, right? It's not a matter of having an asset inventory. The first thing you need to do is it's OT incident response starts and ends with your engineers. Get them to the table. They need to be the ones that tell you, hey, look, what are the trigger events that we need to work with? When do we shut down a plant? When do we isolate the firewall? When do we notify folks? What are our incident response triggers going to be? That's the first thing to figure out. Then you look at your systems out there and say, well, hey, to meet our schedule, to meet our production demands, to maintain safe and efficient operations, these are the processes, these are the process cells, these are the plants, these are the operations, these are the things that we need to have operating at whatever level of efficiency. Then the next step to that is you go through and you say, well, what network hardware, what control hardware, what are all the technical points that support all those systems? So when you've come up with what are the systems and processes and all the components that you need to maintain safe and efficient operations, congratulations, you've just identified your critical assets. Now, if you're in power, obviously you have some other processes out there, but when it really comes down to it, at the end of the day, your job in IT incident response, your job in OT incident response is to maintain safe and efficient operations. And this is the process that you go through to say, what's the recovery point objectives and availability of the system to get to a minimum viable architecture to maintain safe and efficient operations. Those are your critical assets. That's where you then need to go through, identify your technical controls. Do you have the right controls in place? Are you collecting the data that you need from those? Are you getting that into a SOC efficiently? Do you actually get an effective response out of them? Do you need to know within 5 minutes or 5 hours? That will totally change your MSSP strategy, for example, right? It could totally change that. But if you need to have a 5-second response or a 5-minute response, and you only have a 4-hour response window out of your SOC, then we definitely have an alignment problem that we need to work with, right? From there, take all this data, look at your people, process, and technology, look at your skill gaps. What skill enhancement we need to get people on the IT and the OT side speaking the right language? What training, what skill enhancement, what staffing levels do we need to support that? And then from there, develop that into your IR plan. Coordinate with your business units, coordinate with your vendors, your integrators. You're going to find out that when you change this on your head, you take accountability to own and execute on your own plan. No longer are you going to be dependent upon, hey, how do I recover the system that you sold me last year? Because you may be able to delegate responsibility, but fundamentally, you're accountable. Change the model, turn it on its head. Now you're there, your vendors are there to support you in your operations, support you in your availability and uptime goals. Right? So with that, to just kind of wrap things up, start, stop, continue. Stop ignoring the past lessons. It can and likely will happen to pretty much every company out there. In fact, a lot of the big IRs that worked this last year, it's the second or third or fourth time that they've been hit and they finally went, enough is enough. We need to do something. I would rather not have to deal with your company when they're having their third or fourth lesson out there. I really want you to be out there ahead of this and say, hey, look, this was bad there just for a couple little things. Continue to work to improve your OT network detection and aligning that with OT, right? Aligning that with OT, get the engineers at the table. So start engaging in engineering, get a proactive plan and a reactive plan in place. You need to have proactive plans. That's your threat hunt. That is your IR planning. That's your drills, your exercises, your tabletops. Plan for the worst day to happen when you're going to have to be reactive. You're never going to completely eliminate reactive, but plan for that worst day by improving, or in some cases, if you don't have it, creating your OT incident response strategy and start that process today. And with that, thank you all very much for your time today. I really look forward to speaking with you all in the future, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the show.